Imagine waking up for a second not in an apartment, but in a living pod suspended above a city. There's no elevator. You climb into your own personal flying cabin and fly to work, which waits for you somewhere down below, among greenery and quiet, because all the factories and roads have long since been tucked underground. In the evenings, your building's roof turns into a running track, and streets in the usual sense simply don't exist. They were abolished back at the design stage. Sounds like an episode of a science fiction series. But this isn't a screenwriter's invention. It's an actual thesis project defended in Moscow in 1928 by a 29-year-old student. And that's just one of dozens of cities of the future that the world's best architects designed down to the smallest detail and then never built. Today we're going to walk through a city that never existed. Or rather, several cities at once, each of which promise to change the way humanity lives. We'll talk about why ambitious dreamers keep trying to wipe the map clean and redraw it, and why, every single time, reality turns out to be stronger than the blueprints. Let's start with the man whose name became synonymous with the word utopia. In architecture, the Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier. In the 1920s, Paris, like most major European cities, was drowning in its own overcrowding. Narrow medieval streets, packed neighborhoods, filth, diseases that spread precisely because of the dense, chaotic building stock. Le Corbusier looked at this and saw not a historical heritage, but a problem to be solved through engineering. In 1925, he presented the Plan Voisin, a project that left Parisian officials breathless, and not in a good way. The architect proposed demolishing a large part of central Paris on the right bank of the Seine, including the historic districts of Marais and Temple, and erecting 18 identical cross-shaped skyscrapers, 200 meters tall, in their place. Between them, enormous parks, wide high-speed roads, a complete absence of narrow streets in the old sense. He wrote about it bluntly. We must destroy and throw the corpses on the garbage heap. He meant entire neighborhoods of old Paris. The project was, of course, rejected. But Le Corbusier didn't give up. He developed the idea into a larger-scale plan called the Radiant City, or Ville Radieuse. This was no longer a redevelopment of one specific city, but a universal model for any city of the future. At its core was a principle borrowed from the human body. A city needed its own brain, a business center with skyscrapers for 500 to 800,000 workers, its own lungs, vast green zones, and a strict division into functional zones. Here you work, here you live, here you rest. No mixing whatsoever. No spontaneity of street life, the kind tourists so love in old European cities. Ville Radieuse never actually appeared on the map of the world in the form its author drew it. No city dared to demolish itself for its sake entirely. But something strange happened. The idea itself spread across the world like a virus, sprouting in pieces. The principles of the Radiant City formed the basis of the 1933 Athens Charter, a document that shaped how new districts were designed across the entire planet for decades. The residential towers surrounded by green lawns that you see in the suburbs of many post-Soviet and European cities are the direct descendants of Le Corbusier's unrealized dream. And once, he was given a chance to build an entire city from scratch, not in Europe, but in India. After the country's partition in 1947, the newly created state of Punjab needed a new capital, and the architect was invited to design the city of Chandigarh. This became the closest he ever got to fully realizing his dream, though by then it was already heavily adjusted by reality, budget, and local conditions. Interestingly, When Le Corbusier first visited New York in 1935, he called the city utterly devoid of harmony. In his view, its skyscrapers were the product of American developers' inferiority complex rather than genuine urban planning. He dreamed of rebuilding that megacity too, according to his own blueprints, and never got that chance either. Now let's move from bourgeois Paris to revolutionary Moscow of that same decade. The year is 1928. At the Higher Art and Technical Studios, the legendary EPCOT, the Soviet counterpart to Germany's Bauhaus. A young architecture student named Georgy Krutikov is defending his thesis. While his classmates rushed off for summer break, he spent his final days finishing the drawings for a project called the City of the Future. The idea was simple in words and absolutely insane in concept. Split the city's functions vertically. Factories, roads, public spaces stay on the ground. Housing moves into the sky. Krutikov designed residential communes shaped like rings and parabolas that literally hung in the air, held up, according to the author's concept, by something close to atomic energy, although he never quite got around to explaining the technical details of that process. To get from the ground to your home in the clouds, a person was meant to use a special individual cabin, a flying vehicle capable of moving through air, on land, and even underwater. In essence, Krutikov invented personal flying transport for every resident 60 years before similar concepts started appearing in science fiction films. Why would a Soviet student even come up with the idea of lifting housing into the sky? The answer lies in the logic of the era itself. Krutikov believed every social order gives rise to its own form of city. Feudal society built cities around fortresses. Capitalist society built rectangular blocks suited to the needs of trade and production. And, in his conviction, the new communist society was destined to create an entirely new, unprecedented form of settlement, one that would liberate people quite literally, physically detaching them from the earth. The project caused a sensation at the defense. It was written about, discussed, admired by architectural historians for decades afterward. But, of course, not a single square meter of the Flying City was ever built, not in 1928 nor later. Soviet architecture soon turned sharply away from avant-garde experimentation toward monumental Stalinist classicism, and the airborne communes had to be forgotten. Krutikov himself went on to a far more down-to-earth career, designing stations for the Moscow Metro, the very ones you could still ride today. He wasn't alone in this kind of thinking, either. Back in 1923, another Soviet architect, Anton Levinsky, had already sketched a similar concept of an airborne city. The idea was clearly floating in the atmosphere of the era, quite literally. Let's jump forward a few decades and across the ocean to New York in 1960. Richard Buckminster Fuller, engineer, inventor, philosopher, and by his own definition, the world's most successful failure, had already made his name with geodesic domes. Lightweight, sturdy spherical structures made of triangular elements that could be assembled quickly out of almost any material. And Fuller decided to go all in. Together with architect Shoji Sadao, he proposed covering the central part of Manhattan, from the East River to the Hudson, from 21st Street to 64th Street, with a single giant transparent dome 3 kilometers in diameter, 3 times taller than the Empire State Building. The concept had a fairly practical justification, at least on paper. The dome was meant to regulate the microclimate inside. In winter, there would be no need to heat each building separately. In summer, no need to cool each office separately, since the entire area under the dome would maintain a moderate temperature as a single system. Fuller calculated this could cut the city's energy consumption to as little as 20% of 1960 levels. Air pollution would drop too, and, by his estimates, even the savings on snow removal alone would pay for the dome's construction within about 10 years. The project never came close to even a preliminary stage of construction. The cost of such a structure was astronomical, and the very idea of sealing millions of residents of a megacity under a single dome raised far more questions than answers. What about ventilation on such a scale? What about airspace property rights over entire neighborhoods? Who would control a single climate system for millions of people? Yet the concept of a domed city proved remarkably persistent. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the idea of putting a dome over a city was seriously discussed more than once, though by then for smaller towns. Fuller himself was even brought in as a consultant for a real discussion about covering the entire town of Winooski, Vermont, with a dome to protect it from harsh winters, though that plan, too, stayed on paper. Still, the world did get something out of Fuller's grand ambitions. The most famous realized geodesic dome is the American Pavilion at the 1967 World's Fair in Montreal, the famous Biosphere, which you can still see today on St. Helens Island. It's essentially the only proof that the technology worked. Nobody just ever dared to scale it up to the size of an entire megacity. Not all unrealized cities of the future stayed purely on the drawing board. Some actually began to be built for real, and that's precisely why their stories hurt more than those of purely paper utopias. Italian-American architect Paolo Soleri published a book in 1969 titled Arcology, The City in the Image of Man, presenting a concept he himself named arcology, a blend of architecture and ecology. The idea was to build extremely dense, compact city structures that take up minimal horizontal territory, leaving the surrounding nature essentially untouched, as a counterpoint to the suburban sprawl that was engulfing America at the time. In 1970, Soleri began putting this philosophy into practice in the Arizona desert, an hour's drive north of Phoenix. The project was named Arcosanti and was meant to become home to 5,000 people, a compact experimental city built largely by volunteers who came from around the world to learn and build at the same time. Over the following 40 years, more than 6,000 volunteers took part in the construction. And here lies the most important part of this story. Arcosanti has been under construction for over 50 years now, and it still isn't finished. When Paolo Soleri died in 2013 at the age of 94, the project was estimated to be only about 20% complete relative to its original design. Today, Arcosanti consists of just 13 buildings, and the population of this city of dreams meant for 5,000 residents rarely exceeds 100 people at any given time. Construction in the classic sense has essentially stopped. The project now lives on as a foundation, an educational center, and a pilgrimage site for architects who still come to look at the unfinished dream. Why did this happen? Several factors converged here. Funding relied largely on selling ceramic wind bells crafted by the residents themselves, nowhere near enough for a city of such ambition. Soleri himself, by volunteers' accounts, was a difficult man, known for a reputation as a rigid, singular authority who was reluctant to share control over the project's vision even with people who had dedicated years of their lives to building it. And most fundamentally, a model built entirely on enthusiasm and unpaid labor simply couldn't scale to the size of an actual city. Arcosanti became living proof of an important truth. Between a brilliant idea and a city where people can actually live lies a chasm of money, compromises, communal infrastructure, and plain human exhaustion. It's not enough to draw a utopia. You also have to sustain it, year after year, decade after decade. Before we get to our final story, there's one more dreamer who deserves a place on this list. And he wasn't an architect at all. He was Walt Disney. In October 1966, 2 months before he died of lung cancer, Walt Disney sat down in front of a camera in a hospital gown and delivered a 25-minute presentation about a city he intended to build in Central Florida. This wasn't a vague, dreamy pitch. He used a map, a detailed scale model, and precise figures. The city would be called EPCOT, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. And here's the twist most people don't know. EPCOT was never meant to be a theme park at all. It was meant to be an actual, functioning city, home to 20,000 permanent residents. Disney had grown to despise what American cities had become in his lifetime. The traffic, the pollution, the sprawl, the ugly highways cutting through downtowns. His answer was radical: a city with no cars whatsoever. Residents would move around on an electric monorail and a network of walkways, while all deliveries, freight, and utilities would run through service tunnels hidden entirely beneath the surface. At the center would stand a climate-controlled downtown under a great covered dome, ringed by neighborhoods, and, on the outer edge, a belt of industrial parks where corporations like Siemens and ExxonMobil would test and showcase their newest technologies for the public to see. But EPCOT came with a catch that even devoted Disney fans find hard to swallow today. Nobody would actually own their home or their land. Everything would remain the property of the Disney company. There would be no local elections and no municipal voting rights for residents. The company itself would write and enforce the city's rules. Appliances and infrastructure could be swapped out and upgraded by the company without much warning, since Walt explicitly wanted EPCOT to be a permanent testing ground, a city that, in his own words, will never be completed, constantly showcasing whatever new material or system American industry had just invented. 2 months after that hospital gown presentation, Walt Disney died. His brother Roy tried to carry the Florida project forward, but without Walt's personal obsession driving it, the plan for an actual city quietly fell apart. Roy didn't believe the company could pull off something so ambitious and complicated without Walt at the helm, and there were also mounting legal concerns. Nobody had a clear answer for how a private corporation could legally govern thousands of full-time residents with essentially no civic rights of their own. So in 1971, Walt Disney World opened with just the Magic Kingdom and a handful of hotels. And in 1982, the name EPCOT resurfaced, not as a city, but as a theme park, half permanent World's Fair, half showcase of future technology, built roughly where the real city was once meant to stand. If you've ever ridden the People Mover in Tomorrowland at Disneyland, you've actually glimpsed a small piece of the real dream. A scale model of Progress City, originally built for the 1964 World's Fair, still slowly spins beneath the tracks. The closest physical trace left of the city Walt Disney never got to build. And finally, a story that's unfolding right now, before our eyes, in the desert of the Persian Gulf. In 2006, the government of Abu Dhabi announced Masdar City, a city meant to become the world's first truly zero-carbon, zero-waste, car-free settlement. The buildings were to be placed on a raised platform 9 meters high, with a network of driverless electric transport running beneath it, replacing conventional roads entirely. Electricity would come from solar panels, water from a solar-powered desalination plant, and cooling in the scorching climate would be handled by an elaborate system of wind towers and narrow shaded streets inspired by traditional Arab architecture. The project's budget was estimated at $22 billion, with a completion timeline of just 8 years. Then came 2008, and the global financial crisis hit ambitious construction plans across the entire planet. Masdar was no exception. Funding shrank sharply, timelines began slipping, and along with them, the goals themselves quietly began shrinking too, step by step. First, the fully underground transportation network was abandoned. Then the zero-carbon goal was softened into the vaguer term low-carbon city. The ban on cars also had to be relaxed. As of today, nearly 20 years after the project began, only about 10% of the planned city area has been built. The completion date, originally set for 2016, has been pushed back to 2030, and even that deadline is considered optimistic by many observers. The project's design manager openly admitted that even if the city is eventually completed in full, it will never actually achieve true zero emissions. Too much carbon-intensive material, concrete, glass, steel, has already gone into the buildings constructed so far. Still, it would be unfair to call Masdar City a complete failure. The portion that has actually been built does function as a genuine showcase for green technologies. Students at the affiliated Sustainability Institute still study there, and it continues to serve as a testing ground for urban cooling solutions in extreme heat, solutions that are now drawing interest from urban planners around the world. It's just turned out to be a completely different city from the one announced back in 2006. Not a revolution. One working laboratory in the middle of a large, unfinished field if you trace all these stories in sequence. From Le Corbusier's Parisian skyscrapers to the desert ambitions of Masdar, a fairly stubborn pattern emerges. Each of these cities was born in the mind of one person or a small group of people who were absolutely convinced they knew the right way for everyone else to live. And each of them ran into roughly the same obstacles. Money always runs out faster than construction takes. An existing city, with its residents, habits, and property rights, is far harder to tear down than to sketch on a blueprint. And people stubbornly refuse to live as correctly as architects propose, continuing instead to want narrow streets, spontaneous markets, and the messy chaos of a living city instead of a perfectly ruled-out space. And yet none of these dreams went to waste. The Athens Charter, born from the never-realized Ville Radieuse, shaped the face of new districts across the world for decades. Fuller's geodesic dome became a symbol of the Montreal exhibition. Arcosanti still teaches architects compact thinking in an era when cities have finally started worrying about their own sprawl. And the lessons from Masdar's shortfalls are now being studied by the creators of new smart cities, from Saudi Arabia to South Korea, as they try not to repeat the exact same mistakes. Perhaps the true function of a city of the future isn't to eventually be built down to the very last detail. Perhaps it's to remain a provocation, one that forces us to reconsider how we build our present-day cities. Every unfinished utopia isn't a failure. It's a rough draft that the next generation of architects reads before drawing their own. So which city of the future would you actually want to see built for real? Let me know in the comments. And, of course, subscribe if you'd like to keep exploring, together with me, cities that never existed.